So Volkswagen just committed $7.9 billion to its flagship North American Gigafactory. And the site is Street Thomas, Ontario. Not Georgia, not Tennessee, not South Carolina, not any of the southern American states whose governors had been actively competing for the investment with tax packages measured in the billions and infrastructure commitments measured in decades. Not a regional preference decision, not a labor cost calculation, not a supply chain optimization, a strategic capital allocation decision made by the Risk Management Committee of one of the largest automotive manufacturers in the world, reviewed by the Volkswagen Group board, approved by the PowerCo subsidiary leadership, announced formally at a groundbreaking ceremony attended by the Ontario Premier, the CEO of Volkswagen Group, PowerCo, executive leadership, the European Union Trade Commissioner present via video link, and a representative of the German Chancellor physically present at the site. The ceremony was not contingent on further negotiation. The excavation had already begun. The factory is being built in Canada with 3,000 direct jobs and 30,000 indirect supply chain jobs that Southern American economic development agencies had been counting on capturing for years. Within hours of the formal announcement, Georgia's Department of Economic Development issued a statement describing the losses deeply disappointing. Tennessee state officials demanded federal answers about why the investment moved north, and South Carolina's governor called an emergency meeting with his state's industrial recruitment team to assess what had happened and what could be done. Volkswagen's PowerCo board released a rare level of transparency in the form of a publicly summarized decision memorandum that explained the specific reasoning behind the site selection and the language the board used. Regulatory stability, critical minerals, proximity, energy grid reliability, and long-term contract enforcement confidence was read across every investment analyst's desk as the careful corporate translation of a single underlying judgment. Canada is currently predictable. The United States currently is not. And a $7.9 billion multi-deed commitment requires predictability that American policy has not been able to credibly guarantee. Trump's response was visible anger, a true social post within the hour, a press event by the afternoon, threats against Volkswagen that the company's legal department immediately assessed as unenforceable, and a demand that the company reverse the decision that every corporate governance expert noted was not a decision a foreign board could reverse at American political request. Warren Buffett, who has spent 70 years studying capital allocation as the purest and most honest verdict any economic system receives about its own attractiveness, delivered an analysis that connected Volkswagen's decision to a broader pattern that American policy commentary had largely missed over the preceding 30 months. And Mark Carney stood at the Street Thomas site with the Volkswagen CEO beside him and the German Chancellor's representative in the crowd and spoke 9 words that are now being quoted in every investment committee meeting from Frankfurt to Tokyo. Hit subscribe, because the capital allocation pattern Volkswagen just joined is accelerating, not settling. When you hear exactly what Volkswagen committed to and why the scale matters beyond the dollar figure, why the company's decision memorandum described Canada as the obvious choice once regulatory risk premiums were applied to American options, what Trump said across the year preceding the decision that made American investment untenable, what pattern Volkswagen joined that represents $4 billion in manufacturing investment that has flowed to Canada instead of the United States during the past 30 months, and what Buffett says about capital allocation is the verdict markets deliver about jurisdictions. You will understand why this is not a news story about one German multinational making one investment decision. This is the visible inflection point where a structural shift in North American manufacturing investment became publicly undeniable. The moment the market delivered its verdict on American economic policy with a clarity that political commentary had not yet been able to match. American manufacturing dominance was built over 70 years of consistent policy, sustained alliance relationships, and the regulatory stability that long-duration industrial capital requires. That dominance is now visibly eroding. The Street Thomas groundbreaking is the data point that forces the acknowledgement. Let me walk you through exactly what Volkswagen committed to, because the scale of the decision matters beyond the dollar figure, and the specifics revealed the sophistication of the strategic reasoning underneath it. The formal Volkswagen Power Co. announcement committed $7.9 billion of direct capital investment into the Street Thomas, Ontario facility, a 90 gigawatt-hour annual production capacity gigafactory that will manufacture the battery cells that power the next generation of Volkswagen's electric vehicle lineup across North American and European markets. First battery cells are scheduled for production in 2027. Full production capacity is expected by 2030. Direct employment at the facility will exceed 3,000 positions, with indirect supply chain employment across the regional automotive industrial base projected to exceed 30,000 positions over the facility's operating life. The facility will be one of the largest EV battery manufacturing installations in the world, a scale that cements its anchor status for the surrounding industrial supply chain, because every Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 supplier to the facility will need to make its own site selection decision about proximity. And the default answer for every supplier will now be located near Street Thomas. The American competition that lost this investment had been actively developing for years. Georgia's Department of Economic Development had positioned the state as a priority destination for European EV manufacturing investment, with tax holidays, training subsidies, and infrastructure commitments that totaled in the billions. Tennessee had offered similar packages. South Carolina had deployed aggressive industrial recruitment resources. Each southern state had built its competitive case on its workforce, its energy infrastructure, its logistics access, and the federal incentives available under the Inflation Reduction Act that had been specifically designed to attract exactly this kind of EV manufacturing investment into American facilities. The assumption throughout the American competition was that the combination of federal tax credits and state incentive packages would be decisive, and Southern American governors had been traveling to Wolfsburg, Germany, and to Volkswagen's other executive offices across the year preceding the decision to make personal cases for their respective states. None of it was decisive. All of it lost to Ontario. The Canadian package that won the investment matched American incentives dollar for dollar, where the math required matching. But the Canadian package's decisive advantage was not in the headline numbers. Ontario provincial commitments combined with Canadian federal production tax credits to deliver a package. The total value exceeded $13 billion over the life of the facility. Training subsidies, infrastructure development, production tax credits aligned with American IRA provisions that Canada had quietly matched through its own clean economy, investment tax credit framework, skills development resources, and site infrastructure that had already been substantially prepared through earlier investments. Beyond the money, the Canadian package offered something American jurisdictions could not offer at any price: contract stability independent of American political cycle risk. The Canadian government's commitments were structured through frameworks that survived elections, required cabinet review to unwind, and were explicitly insulated from the kind of executive order reversals that had become a feature of American regulatory environment over the preceding year. The symbolism of the Volkswagen board delivering this investment outside American manufacturing capacity. Historically, German automakers had shown strong preference for Southern American states, was itself a deliberate signal about how the global automotive industry now evaluated the American investment environment. But the real power of Volkswagen's decision is not in the announcement. It is in the decision memorandum that explained precisely why the company chose Canada over every available American option. And the reasoning revealed a level of strategic sophistication that American commentary had not anticipated. The memorandum identified 7 decisive factors, each one assessed independently and scored against both Canadian and American alternatives, and the aggregate scoring drove the final recommendation. Regulatory stability received the highest weight in the evaluation because the facility represented a 40-year operational commitment. And a 40-year commitment requires regulatory environments that will remain consistent across political cycles rather than changing with each new administration. The memorandum specifically cited recent American executive order reversals on environmental regulations, trade agreements, and industrial policy as evidence that American regulatory environment had entered a period of unpredictability that long-duration manufacturing capital could not accept without substantial risk premiums that changed the economic case entirely. Critical minerals proximity was the second weighted factor. What if the next major shift in global manufacturing power isn't decided in Washington or Beijing, but in a quiet construction site in Ontario, where billions of dollars, decades of industrial planning, and the future of electric vehicles are being locked into place right now? Because that is exactly what is unfolding in this story. Not a single corporate announcement, but a broader structural shift in how global capital is choosing where to build the industries of the future, and why some of North America's traditional manufacturing centers are suddenly losing ground in ways that are becoming impossible to ignore. Electric vehicle battery production depends on a tightly controlled set of critical minerals, including lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and manganese. These materials are not optional inputs. They are the foundation of the entire EV transition. And in this context, supply security becomes more than just an economic concern. It becomes a strategic requirement. Canada's approach to critical minerals has created a system where mining and processing capacity is being developed domestically at a scale that remains incomplete in the United States. That difference, though technical on the surface, is becoming central to billion-dollar investment decisions. In the case of Volkswagen's North American strategy, internal planning highlighted Canadian lithium reserves in Quebec, nickel operations across Ontario and Manitoba, cobalt processing capacity within Ontario, and graphite supply chains that together formed a more complete and predictable upstream system than what American sourcing could guarantee at the same level of maturity for a company making multi-decade decisions about EV production. That level of stability in inputs is not a minor advantage. It is foundational. But materials alone were not the deciding factor. Energy systems played an equally important role. Ontario and Quebec rely heavily on hydroelectric power, which provides low carbon, stable, and predictable electricity pricing. That matters significantly for EV battery production, especially when products must meet strict international emissions requirements. The European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism effectively penalizes high carbon production. Batteries manufactured in regions with cleaner grids are therefore easier and cheaper to export into European markets. In contrast, American energy grids vary widely in carbon intensity depending on the state, introducing uncertainty that complicates long-term compliance planning for global exporters. That uncertainty translated into financial risk. If battery cells produced in the United States fail to meet EU carbon thresholds, they could face tariffs when re-entering European markets. That would directly affect Volkswagen's global competitiveness, making production location a critical economic variable rather than a simple logistical choice. Another layer in the decision came from legal and regulatory predictability. Canadian contract law has long been viewed by international investors as stable and consistent, with enforcement mechanisms that change slowly over time. In contrast, recent years in the United States have introduced increased uncertainty around trade policy, industrial subsidies, and regulatory consistency. The possibility of policy reversals through executive action, changes in incentive programs, or sudden tariff adjustments created a risk profile that long-term investors had to account for. For a company planning facilities that will operate for 30 to 40 years, even small variations in legal predictability become amplified across the full investment horizon. Risk management teams are not evaluating political rhetoric. They are quantifying exposure over decades. Trade access added another dimension. Canada's trade agreement with the European Union provides direct market access that integrates Canadian manufacturing into both North American and European supply chains. That dual access structure allows vehicles and batteries produced in Canada to move more freely into multiple major markets. American facilities, by comparison, do not currently benefit from the same integrated trade advantage into Europe at the same scale, limiting their strategic flexibility. Workforce availability was also decisive. Ontario's automotive sector has been built over decades through the presence of major global automakers, creating a deep labor pool of skilled engineers, technicians, and manufacturing specialists. That existing workforce reduces ramp-up time and lowers operational risk for new facilities. Instead of building talent from scratch, companies can immediately access experienced labor at scale. But perhaps the most influential factor in Volkswagen's internal assessment was what its analysts described as political risk premium. This refers to the additional cost assigned to uncertainty in government behavior over the life of an investment. In the United States, A series of policy signals over the preceding year increased that premium significantly. Repeated tariff threats on automotive components created uncertainty about long-term cost structures. Foreign manufacturers were occasionally singled out in policy discussions, raising concerns about uneven regulatory treatment depending on political conditions. Incentive programs tied to EV production credits were also perceived as potentially reversible depending on future administrations. Even trade tensions involving Canada itself contributed to this risk perception. Aggressive trade rhetoric signaled that North American trade relationships could shift rapidly, affecting supply chains that depend on cross-border stability. Individually, these risks were manageable. Combined, they created a cumulative uncertainty that affected long-term investment viability. As Volkswagen finalized its decision, the broader political reaction in the United States was immediate. Federal and state officials scrambled to assess what had gone wrong in the recruitment process. Southern states that had actively competed for the investment issued carefully worded statements attributing the outcome to policy uncertainty at the federal level. While diplomatic in tone, these responses made clear that the loss was not seen as isolated. Industry associations began to frame the decision as part of a wider trend, suggesting that similar outcomes had been building over the past year and a half. Internal communications from economic development agencies reflected concern that this was not a one-time failure, but a directional shift. Within hours, political leadership at the federal level responded with public statements criticizing the decision. Social media reactions included threats of regulatory consequences and accusations, questioning the company's commitment to American manufacturing. However, from an investment standpoint, these reactions reinforced the very concerns that had contributed to the original decision. Rather than reducing uncertainty, they added further signals of volatility in the policy environment. Meanwhile, in Canada, the groundbreaking ceremony for the Street Thomas Gigafactory became a symbolic moment that extended far beyond a single project. With provincial and federal leaders present alongside Volkswagen executives and European representatives, the event represented not just an investment announcement, but the visible consolidation of a manufacturing ecosystem. The speech delivered at the site emphasized Canada's positioning as a destination for long-term capital requiring stability and predictable governance. Without directly criticizing the United States, the framing made clear contrast through structure rather than confrontation. The message was simple. Large-scale industrial capital follows environments where rules remain stable over decades, not election cycles. The phrase that emerged from that moment describing capital as something that asks for stability, not permission, spread rapidly across financial and policy circles. It was quoted in investment research, policy analysis, and corporate strategy discussions because it distilled a core principle of modern industrial decision-making into a single line. Capital is mobile, and it follows certainty. But Volkswagen's decision was not an isolated case. Over the preceding 30 months, a broader pattern had already been forming across North American EV and battery manufacturing. Multiple major commitments had been directed toward Canada, including large-scale investments from international battery manufacturers and automotive firms building integrated supply chains in Ontario and Quebec. These included multi-billion-dollar projects spanning battery production, vehicle assembly, and critical materials processing. Each individual announcement appeared independent at the time, but collectively, they reflected a consistent, directional flow of capital toward one jurisdiction over another. What made this significant was not just the volume of investment, but the clustering effect it began to create. Once battery production begins to concentrate in one region, upstream suppliers follow. Critical mineral processors move closer to production sites. Specialized equipment manufacturers relocate to reduce logistics costs. Engineering and testing services consolidate around emerging hubs. Over time, these layers reinforce each other, making the cluster self-sustaining. Historically, the United States built this kind of industrial clustering over decades in sectors like automotive manufacturing and heavy industry. What is now emerging in Canada is a similar structure forming around electric vehicles and battery production at the most important technological transition point of the century. As this shift accelerated, investors and analysts began to reassess long-term assumptions about North American manufacturing leadership. The question was no longer whether individual projects would choose Canada, but whether the cumulative pattern would become self-reinforcing to the point of structural realignment. Warren Buffett's long-standing perspective on capital allocation added another dimension to this interpretation. His view, shaped by decades of observing